My friend of 8 years accused me of sleeping with his wife. I cut him off and he's asking if I'm still his friend. Looking back on it all, it's hard to believe that a friendship spanning 8 years, practically half my life, could unravel in just a few weeks. I met B when we were just freshmen in high school. Both a little awkward, both figuring ourselves out, but bound by this immediate sense of camaraderie. I don't know what it was exactly that drew us together initially. Maybe just that we both had this natural sarcasm or a love for those random things that didn't interest most of our classmates. He was my brother, in every way that counted. We'd spend afternoons at each other's houses, playing video games until our fingers hurt or watching movies while sharing a giant bag of chips. Through those years, we practically built this unspoken pact to stand by each other no matter what. High school was a blur of late-night texts, road trips to the next town over, trying to act grown up, and then laughing at how little we really knew. Even then, though, we shared this commitment to each other. No judgment, just two guys who had each other's backs. When he started dating N our junior year, I was happy for him. He was my best friend, and it was clear that she was special to him. She was funny, confident, and had this kindness about her that drew people in. The three of us fell into an easy friendship, almost without trying. Graduation was just around the corner, and we thought we had it all figured out. I planned to stick around, and B and N were already talking about their future together. It was the kind of naive certainty that comes with being 17. Like we were invincible. After high school, B and I stayed close even as life nudged us into adulthood. College didn't interest B, so he dove straight into work. While I started a degree at a local college, he and N stayed together through it all, moving into an apartment about a year after graduation. I'll admit, it felt strange watching them settle down, but it also felt right, like things were progressing in the natural way they were supposed to. They were happy. At least, they seemed happy. By the time we were 22, B and N got married. It was surreal, seeing them exchange vows, watching as they promised forever to each other. I felt this sense of pride, like I was watching my brother take this huge step, and I was there to witness it. As I looked at them, I thought back to high school and all those years of shared dreams and inside jokes. It was a moment that felt monumental, like a chapter was closing, and a new one was beginning. We had this tight bond, this history that I thought could survive anything. But the years that followed weren't the picture-perfect life we all imagined. Somewhere along the way, B started changing, and not in the way you expect people to change with age. He started drifting, spending more time with his games and less time on his marriage. I brushed it off, convinced that he was just stressed or maybe overwhelmed. After all, everyone goes through rough patches, and our friendship was one built on loyalty and understanding. It seemed like just a phase, one he'd get through with a bit of encouragement. Now, looking back on it all, I realize how blind I was to the signs. I ignored his flaws, chalking them up to quirks and personality. That's the thing about friendship, sometimes. You give so much grace to people you care about that you forget where the line should be drawn. The idea that this man, my best friend, would one day accuse me of betrayal was beyond anything I could imagine. At that time, though, I had no idea how quickly things would unravel, nor how deeply it would hurt. The shift in B started slowly. At first, it was the little things that went unnoticed. Small changes that I wrote off as part of adjusting to married life. He'd skip our plans last minute or cancel on hangouts, saying he had things to do or that he needed to catch up on sleep. I figured it was normal. He was settling into life with N and things naturally change. But over time, it was hard not to see the reality creeping in. He was slipping. And everything that once defined him was fading into this almost unrecognizable version of the friend I once knew. N started reaching out to me, hinting at her frustration. She wasn't one to complain, but I could tell she was holding things in. She confided that B had quit his job, saying he needed a break and that he'd figure things out soon. But soon turned into months, and it became apparent that he was doing nothing to change his situation. Day in and day out, he was home, glued to the gaming console, a headset strapped on as he dove into his online world. He'd play from the moment he woke up to the dead of night, living almost entirely in a virtual world. Meanwhile, N was working 50-hour weeks, sometimes even picking up extra shifts just to keep their bills paid. One day, N reached out to me more directly, voicing her concerns. She wasn't angry or resentful, at least. Not outwardly. She just seemed tired. A kind of exhaustion that went beyond lack of sleep. She asked if I could talk to B, maybe try to reason with him in a way that she couldn't. As much as she loved him, he just wasn't pulling his weight. And she needed him to step up. To show that he cared enough about their life together to actually contribute to it. When I spoke to him, it was like talking to a wall. I gently tried to nudge him back to reality. Reminding him of the plans we all used to make. The ambitions he'd once had. But he shrugged it off. Making excuses and brushing off the idea that his gaming addiction was affecting anything. He'd mutter things like, "I'll get a job when I'm ready." Or, "N's just stressed, she doesn't get it." I wanted to shake him. Make him see the toll he was taking on her and on their marriage. But every word I said seemed to fall flat. Instead of hearing me out, he'd retreat further, snapping at me, saying I didn't understand, or that I was just siding with her. The last time I tried, he outright dismissed me. He told me he didn't need a lecture and that I was just parroting everything N was already saying. It hurt to hear him push me away. But I thought he'd eventually come around. I believed he just needed a wake-up call, a moment to realize the damage he was doing. But that moment never came. Instead, things got worse. N, understandably, had her limits. No one could sustain a one-sided relationship forever. Especially not one where you're carrying all the weight. So, she made the decision to end things. They divorced, and I tried to be there for him, hoping he'd finally understand the gravity of what he'd done and maybe take steps to make things right. For his own sake, if nothing else. But instead of accepting any accountability, he turned on me. When B and N divorced, I knew it was the best decision for her. But I couldn't shake the weight of it all. It was like watching two people I cared about break apart. Yet only one of them seemed to feel the true impact of what had happened. B just spiraled further, throwing all his energy into resentment rather than self-reflection. I had hoped this would be his wake-up call. That he'd hit rock bottom and realize how much he needed to change. But he refused to see it. Instead, he became fixated on the idea that he was the one wronged. That N and everyone around him had turned their backs. After the split, I did my best to keep him afloat. I spent hours on the phone, listening to him rant, driving out to see him, trying to help him make sense of it all. I didn't expect a sudden transformation, but I hoped he'd start facing the truth, that his own actions had led to this. But each conversation circled back to one idea, that it was somehow everyone else's fault. A few weeks after the divorce, he moved back in with his parents. That was when he called me for one of his typical late-night check-ins. He was upset, his voice slurred with frustration or maybe something stronger. I listened, trying to stay patient as he went through his usual complaints. Then, out of nowhere, he dropped the accusation that changed everything. He went quiet for a second, then said, "You know, N probably cheated on me with you." There was no humor in his voice. No sign that he was joking. My mind went blank, a wave of disbelief rushing over me. It felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Blindsided by the very friend I'd tried so hard to stand by. "Are you serious?" I managed to ask, but he brushed me off as if I was the one being unreasonable. He insisted, saying it only made sense. That I'd been too close to N constantly checking in on her while he was stuck at home. He went on, rambling about how she'd always seemed to trust me, confide in me, and that he was sure it wasn't just friendly concern. It felt surreal, hearing him spin these wild accusations as if they were cold, hard facts. I barely got a word in before he continued, acting like he'd figured it all out. I couldn't help but snap. Anger finally bubbling over, I reminded him of everything I'd done to support him. How I'd been the one trying to help him make things work with N when he couldn't even help himself. I told him that his inability to take responsibility was the reason his marriage had fallen apart. That he was so desperate to blame someone else that he'd turned on the one person who'd stood by him. But he wouldn't hear any of it. He doubled down, saying if I was truly his friend, I'd convince her to come back, or at least own up to whatever he'd convinced himself had happened between us. He threw words like betrayal and loyalty around as if I was the one who'd failed him, twisting the narrative so much that it felt like he was erasing every shred of our friendship. I was done. I realized in that moment that the friend I'd once known was gone, replaced by someone so wrapped up in his bitterness that he couldn't see the reality in front of him. I didn't have it in me to keep fighting for someone who'd thrown me under the bus without a second thought. Walking away from an 8-year friendship felt impossible. But what choice did I have? That accusation felt like a punch that wouldn't stop throbbing. A hurt that kept aching even after I'd told him off. I realized in that instant how much resentment he was carrying, not just toward N but toward me and anything or anyone who dared to challenge his version of reality. I'd been his friend through some of the toughest years of our lives. But none of that seemed to matter. I was done trying to be the rational voice. The friend who would sit through endless self-pitying rants. It wasn't just about the accusation, though. That was merely the final push. The moment that shoved me over the edge. I started thinking back to all the moments I'd let slide. Those times he'd blown up over minor issues or blamed everyone but himself for his problems. I realized that I'd been bending over backward for years to keep our friendship together. Ignoring the signs that things had been fractured for a long time. It was like I'd spent years trying to patch up a crumbling wall. Blind to the fact that it was collapsing from the inside out. So, I blocked him on everything. Social media, messaging apps, even my phone. There was no way I was going to let him keep trying to drag me back into his web of delusion and anger. Cutting him off was a line in the sand. A declaration that I was no longer willing to be his emotional punching bag. It felt like a weight was lifting. Like I was finally free from the constant guilt and obligation I'd been carrying for so long. In the days that followed, I expected to feel some pangs of regret. But instead, I felt relief. I was surprised by how little I missed him. The silence was peaceful. For the first time in years, I didn't have to brace myself for the next complaint, the next unreasonable demand, the next guilt trip. My phone wasn't buzzing with messages about how the world was against him or with passive-aggressive comments hinting that I owed him something. Of course, it didn't take long before mutual friends started reaching out. They wanted to know what had happened, asking if there was a way to work things out, if I tried to see things from his perspective. Some of them even hinted that maybe he was just going through a lot and needed a friend to help him through it. But I couldn't make them understand that this wasn't about one bad day or one misstep. It was the culmination of years of selfishness, of expecting everyone around him to clean up the messes he refused to acknowledge. I could tell that some people were judging me for walking away. There were the inevitable whispers about loyalty, about standing by people in their darkest moments. But what they didn't understand was that I had stood by him through more dark moments than I could count. And each time he'd proven that he wasn't willing to change, to grow, to even try. Eventually, he tried one last time to contact me. He emailed, sending a long, rambling message about how he couldn't believe I'd cut him off and that he'd thought I was better than that. It was more of the same, no apologies, no admission of his own role in the fallout. Just a self-pitying letter that twisted everything to make himself the victim. I skimmed it, feeling nothing but exhaustion as I read his words. It was clear that he still hadn't learned a thing, that he'd rather cling to his delusions than face the truth. I didn't respond. There was no point. In the weeks after cutting ties with B, life settled into a different kind of rhythm. It was strange not to have him around, but it also felt surprisingly peaceful. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's problems, wasn't constantly second-guessing whether I was being a good enough friend. The freedom was both unsettling and exhilarating, as if I'd spent so long tethered to his drama that I'd forgotten what life could be like without it. There were moments, though, when I caught myself thinking about our friendship, about the good memories. B and I had been through so much together: high school, first jobs, college struggles, countless late-night talks. It felt like those memories belonged to another life, a time before everything had soured. I wondered if there was something I could have done differently, if maybe I'd been too quick to walk away. But every time I circled back to the thought, I remembered how he'd chosen his own delusions over our friendship, how he'd accused me of the one thing that made our relationship irreparable. And each time, the doubt faded, replaced by a stronger resolve to keep moving forward. The more time passed, the more I realized how much space he'd occupied in my life. How much mental energy I devoted to worrying about him, checking in on him, trying to guide him out of his own messes. Without that weight, I found myself putting more energy into my other friendships, reconnecting with people I'd drifted from over the years. It felt good to be around friends who genuinely cared about me, who didn't view our friendship as a transaction. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen and valued for who I was. Not for what I could provide or fix for someone else. Jackson. The friend who had introduced us to N reached out. He'd heard a bit about what had happened between B and me. And he just wanted to check in. At first, I was hesitant to open up. Part of me worried he'd judge me or side with B, but Jackson surprised me. He listened without judgment, only offering the occasional nod or comment. And by the end of our conversation, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. "That must have been rough," he said after I'd finished recounting everything. "I can't imagine how much that must have hurt. Having someone you cared about turn on you like that." For once, I didn't feel defensive or like I had to explain myself. Jackson got it, and he didn't try to sugarcoat anything or offer empty platitudes. He just understood. It was one of those rare moments where I felt validated in a way I hadn't even realized I needed. After that, I began focusing more on my own goals. Diving back into projects I'd neglected and dreams I'd pushed aside in the chaos of B's life. I picked up old hobbies, reconnected with family, and even started thinking seriously about my future. Not the future of someone I felt obligated to save. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. There were moments of doubt. Nights when I wondered if I'd done the right thing. If I'd lost a friend or if he'd simply lost himself. But those moments grew fewer and farther between, replaced by a steady confidence that I was finally doing what was right for me. The final straw of closure came one day, months later, when I ran into a mutual friend. She mentioned in passing that B was still the same. Still spiraling. Still blaming everyone else for his problems. It stung to hear, but it also reaffirmed that I'd made the right decision. I could have stayed in that loop forever, trying to rescue someone who didn't want to be saved. Or I could choose to move forward. To find people who brought out the best in me instead of pulling me into their shadows. And that's exactly what I did. I chose me, and it turned out to be the best decision I'd ever made. Cutting B out of my life was a decision I stood by. But it also left scars. Ones I didn't recognize until I started to get closer with other friends. Suddenly, I'd catch myself second-guessing simple things. Like whether they were being genuine or what they might be saying about me when I wasn't around. Before B's accusations, I'd never really questioned my friend's loyalty. But his betrayal left me with this strange, gnawing feeling, like I was always waiting for someone else to turn on me too. It was Jackson who first noticed the shift in me. He'd invited me to a small gathering at his place. Just a few friends hanging out and catching up. It felt good to relax. To laugh without tension in my shoulders. But at one point, he pulled me aside and looked at me with concern in his eyes. "Hey, are you okay? I don't know, it just seems like you're kind of holding back." I was startled. Was it that obvious? I'd been trying so hard to pretend like everything was fine. But here he was, seeing right through it. I let out a sigh and nodded. "Yeah, I guess I'm just still figuring out how to trust people again. B's stuff messed me up more than I realized." Jackson nodded, understanding in his expression. "That makes sense. Take your time. Man, we're here for you." Those words meant everything to me. And for the first time, I realized I didn't have to pretend like I was completely fine. Maybe real friends, friends who cared, didn't expect me to be anything other than what I was. It was strange how this conversation unlocked something inside me. I didn't feel the need to defend myself or prove that I was right. Jackson's quiet support reminded me of how friendship was supposed to feel: light. Supportive, free of drama. Gradually, I started to let my guard down. It wasn't a quick or easy process. There were days when I'd get paranoid, convinced that people might be thinking the worst of me. But I'd catch myself in those thoughts, reminding myself that not everyone was like B, not everyone saw friendship as disposable. I began to believe that maybe I could still find people who valued me as much as I valued them. One of the most pivotal moments came during another gathering with friends. I shared a story about an old trip I'd taken with B, one of those random memories that came to mind when everyone was swapping funny stories. I wasn't sure how it would land, considering how things had ended. But instead of making things awkward, it actually made everyone laugh. There was no weirdness or judgment, just laughter and a sense of connection. It was a reminder that I didn't have to carry the weight of B's mistakes with me forever. Over time, I found myself building a new foundation of friendships. People who showed up, who cared, and who were there for me without any hidden agenda. With them, I found a sense of belonging that I hadn't realized I was missing. It wasn't that I'd replaced B. He'd always have a part in my past. And I couldn't erase that. But I'd finally allowed myself to accept that friendship could be genuine again. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward without looking over my shoulder. Free from the doubt and paranoia that had followed me since my falling out with B, letting new people in. Trusting them with my vulnerabilities and finding joy in the moments we shared. Was like coming up for air after being submerged for far too long. In those new friendships, I found myself healing, and in healing, I found hope that maybe, just maybe, the best parts of life, the laughter, the trust, the sense of belonging, were still ahead of me. As I began embracing my new friendships, I couldn't completely shake the shadow of B's betrayal. It would creep in during quiet moments, lingering like an unwelcome guest. The accusations, the blame shifting, the way he turned my loyalty into a weapon. These thoughts haunted me in a way I hadn't anticipated. And yet, facing those memories was like turning on the lights in a dark room. They seemed less daunting once I let myself look at them directly. It wasn't easy. But I started unpacking the reality of my friendship with B. There were good memories, great ones. But beneath them lay a pattern I hadn't noticed before. I thought back to the times when B had downplayed my accomplishments or subtly made me feel like I was somehow failing him. The more I reflected, the clearer it became. My friendship with B hadn't always been as balanced as I'd thought. I'd often excused B's behavior, writing it off as just how he was. But now I could see the little ways he'd pushed boundaries, made me question myself, and expected loyalty from me while offering none in return. All those things I'd brushed off, thinking they were just quirks or personality differences, had actually been warning signs. And while I couldn't go back in time, I realized I could take control over how much of an impact his actions would have on my future. This was my chance to set boundaries, even if they were retroactive. Part of setting those boundaries meant accepting that I didn't owe B anything. Especially not a place in my life. There was a time when I thought loyalty meant standing by someone no matter what. But I was beginning to understand that true loyalty wasn't one-sided. Real friendship meant mutual respect and understanding, not sticking around because of guilt or obligation. That revelation was freeing in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about my future without any traces of B's influence. Without his expectations weighing on me, I felt a sense of lightness. I could decide who I wanted in my life. And I could be selective about it. If B came back and tried to reconnect, I knew that I could say, no, not out of anger, but from a place of self-respect. These realizations didn't just change how I viewed my past with B. They redefined what I expected from all my relationships. I wanted friends who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide or how I could serve their needs. That mindset became a compass for navigating new connections. My past experience with B hadn't made me bitter, if anything. It had made me wiser. The growth I'd experienced, though painful, left me feeling grounded. The sting of betrayal had faded, replaced with a quiet resilience. And with each day that passed, I became more confident that I was on the right path. Not just away from B but toward a life built on respect, honesty, and real, unwavering friendships. This chapter of my life wasn't about holding grudges or clinging to the past. It was about learning, evolving, and choosing a better way forward. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free to move on. Months passed, and the lingering hurt and confusion surrounding B faded, making room for clarity and a new sense of self-assurance. Cutting ties with him had left a void I thought would haunt me. But instead, it became an open space that I filled with growth, new friendships, and time spent reconnecting with the parts of myself that had been neglected. I wouldn't lie and say I'd forgotten the years of friendship altogether or the good memories we shared. They still came to mind every so often. But they no longer held the power to shake me. Instead, they felt like pages from a distant chapter that I could look back on without regret. Now understanding them for what they were, lessons. Through the struggle of dealing with B's accusations and his refusal to take responsibility, I'd found a strength in myself that I didn't know I possessed. It was the courage to walk away from people who didn't value me, who took my loyalty and twisted it into something I could no longer recognize. I'd learned that standing up for myself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. I had a choice in who I allowed into my life. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to make that choice for my own well-being. The experience with B also shifted how I approached friendships moving forward. I became intentional about fostering connections that were healthy and reciprocal, where respect and understanding were mutual. It was refreshing to be surrounded by people who genuinely wanted the best for each other. Slowly, my circle became a group that supported, challenged, and encouraged me, a true reflection of the type of friend I wanted to be and the friendships I wanted in return. One evening, I received a text from B. It was short, saying he hoped I was doing well and that he missed our friendship. I stared at it for a while, feeling a pang of something, maybe nostalgia, maybe sadness, but it wasn't enough to make me doubt the journey I'd taken. I knew that reconnecting would mean compromising my boundaries and stepping back into a dynamic that I'd worked so hard to move beyond. In the end, I didn't reply. There was no bitterness in my silence, just a quiet acknowledgement of the past and a firm decision to protect the life I was building. Letting go of that friendship didn't feel like a failure anymore, it felt like the beginning of something much healthier. A foundation rooted in self-respect and honesty. If I ever looked back, it would be as a reminder of how far I'd come, not just in moving on from B but in recognizing my worth and embracing the friendships that honored it. I wasn't the same person who had once clung to loyalty out of obligation. I was someone who chose to be loyal to myself first. And as I looked ahead, the road felt open, inviting, and filled with the promise of a life lived on my terms. My sister-in-law licked my face and now my brother is not talking to me. The tension between my brother and me had been simmering for a while now. If someone had told me a few years ago that we'd reach this point, I'd have laughed it off. Growing up, my brother and I had been inseparable. Sure, he was 6 years older and seemed a little overbearing at times. But that was just typical big brother behavior. He'd always been the one to tell me what to do. And it wasn't until I hit adulthood that I realized how much he needed that feeling of control. Maybe it made him feel like the responsible one, while I, in his view, was the little brother in need of guidance, no matter how much I grew or how many responsibilities I took on myself. I'll be the first to admit that our family dynamics are complicated. Being adopted, I've always felt a slight tension, not because of my parents but because of my brother's comments. To him, I was always his adopted brother. He had a way of reminding me I was different, even if he didn't mean it maliciously. Sometimes he'd say things like, "You're lucky we took you in," or "Mom and Dad went above and beyond," and even if he meant them as jokes, they stung. Lately, his behavior had only grown more dismissive and condescending. The pressure and judgment increased, particularly when our mom's mental health took a serious nosedive a year ago. My mom had always been the glue holding us together. But everything changed after a tragic incident at her work. She had been taken hostage by an armed man. And though physically unharmed, the emotional scars were deep. She wasn't the same after that, anxious, withdrawn, and often plagued by night terrors. She had to leave her job, which only made things worse, as she'd loved her work and the purpose it brought her. This incident rocked our entire family, and the way we each coped exposed the cracks in our relationships. My brother, true to form, took the tough love approach. In his mind, Mom just needed to snap out of it. And he'd lecture her about how she had survived the experience and needed to move on. I, on the other hand, tried to be there for her, helping her with therapy sessions and generally just offering comfort whenever she needed it. Working as a paramedic had taught me a lot about trauma, and I knew this was something that didn't just go away. But for my brother, empathy took a backseat to his relentless need to be the fixer. Our differing responses to Mom's situation added layers of frustration and resentment between us. Whenever we'd disagree on how to handle her care, he'd throw my adoption in my face, as if I somehow had less right to care for her because we weren't related by blood. It was one of the worst things he could have said to me. And the hurt ran deep, even if I didn't let him see it. In my brother's eyes, I was wrong about everything, from the way I dealt with my job to how I looked after Mom. And he always found a way to bring up COVID and how it affected his life. As if everyone else's struggles paled in comparison. The pandemic seemed to amplify his conspiratorial thinking, his beliefs spiraling in wild directions, leading to arguments on nearly every visit. Even my career as a paramedic, which was both my passion and livelihood, became a point of contention. He'd belittle the risks, shrugging off the dangers I faced on a daily basis as just part of the fear-mongering media agenda. There was no way to talk sense into him. In short, everything felt strained and charged. Even when we tried to keep things light, it was like walking on eggshells. knowing that any little disagreement could set off a whole new argument. And any wrong look could be a potential landmine. At one time, I'd have brushed it off as just a rough patch. But this version of my brother felt like a stranger, a man who saw me as little more than a meddling outsider in his life. It wasn't long before I started questioning just how much of our relationship was built on genuine trust and how much was a shaky foundation ready to crack at any moment. I'll admit, I was caught off guard when my brother's fiancée suggested throwing a surprise party for my birthday. We'd never been close, and while I had nothing against her personally, I couldn't ignore her dramatic, attention-seeking nature. She was the type who'd turn any occasion into her spotlight, an odd trait for someone dating my brother, who enjoyed that limelight as much as she did. But I went along with it. She was enthusiastic, and I figured it'd be nice to have a distraction from everything going on with my family. The party was small but lively, filled mostly with people I barely knew. The room buzzed with laughter and loud music, fueled by plenty of drinks passed around by my brother's fiancée. A few of my friends had come, but the rest were my brother's friends, who seemed to know the house like their own. It felt less like my birthday and more like an excuse for them to have a night of debauchery. But I played along, nursing a drink and trying not to read too deeply into the fact that, yet again, my wants were sidelined. Then came the cake. Everyone gathered around, cheering and singing, and I tried to get into the spirit of it all. But the moment took a strange turn when his fiancée grabbed a bit of frosting, swiped it on my cheek, and giggled. I thought it was harmless, just her way of being playful. I laughed, trying to shake the unease in the pit of my stomach. But then, before I could even process what was happening, she leaned in, grabbed my face with both hands, and licked a long streak of frosting off my cheek. The shock was instant. My brain went blank, my body froze, caught between confusion and embarrassment as I looked around, trying to make sense of it. A few people laughed, but mostly, there was silence, everyone clearly taken aback. My brother's expression went from jovial to stone cold in seconds. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, and I could see the resentment simmering below the surface. He looked at her, then at me, before walking away from the crowd, his shoulders tense and rigid. I didn't know what to do. I figured I'd just act like it was no big deal, brush it off as her being her usual over-the-top self. But it was impossible to ignore the discomfort lingering in the air. I noticed people throwing glances my way, whispering behind cupped hands as they watched my brother and his fiancée storm off to a corner, having a not-so-subtle argument in hushed voices. I wasn't sure what they were saying, but I didn't have to be a mind reader to understand that my brother was angry. I caught snippets of his words, something about boundaries and disrespect, before he turned and left, leaving his fiancée standing there, stunned, before she quickly composed herself and threw herself back into the party as if nothing had happened. The whole situation left a bad taste in my mouth, a heavy sense of dread settling in my chest. I'd always tried to keep things smooth with my brother, especially with everything going on between us lately. But this felt like another chasm forming. I didn't know exactly how this would shake out, but I had a feeling it wasn't going to be good. The next morning, I figured I'd at least touch base with my brother to see if we were good. He and I hadn't seen eye to eye lately, and after last night's debacle, I wanted to nip any misunderstandings in the bud. I texted him a casual, "Hey, you doing all right after last night?" message, hoping he'd respond with something that would let me know we could both laugh it off and move on. Hours passed, and nothing. I started to feel the simmer of frustration. I didn't ask for that party. I didn't ask for his fiancée to lick frosting off my face. And yet, it seemed like I was the one being punished. Late that afternoon, I finally got a response. But it was hardly the simple acknowledgement I'd hoped for. "You need to keep your distance from her. Dude, seriously. Last night was a disaster. And everyone saw it. People are already talking." I was floored. I needed to keep my distance? What on earth was he talking about? My thumbs hovered over my phone, trying to craft a response that wouldn't sound defensive. But before I could even type, he sent another message. "You know what I'm talking about. You know what she's been saying. It's pathetic. We're family." Man, I felt my pulse quicken, anger bubbling up as I reread his messages. What had she been saying? If anything, she should be apologizing to both of us, not twisting things around. It felt like a slap in the face that he'd actually buy into her side of the story. Whatever twisted version she decided to go with, I'd barely even responded to her antics, let alone encouraged anything. I dialed his number, feeling my frustration boiling over. And he picked up after only 2 rings. But his tone was icy. "Hey," I started, doing my best to sound calm. "I don't know what she told you. But whatever it is, it's not true." There was a pause on his end, and I could practically hear the skepticism in his silence. "Look, I saw what happened. Everyone saw. It's obvious she was uncomfortable. And I don't know what you thought you were doing. But she said you were acting like some kind of creep." "Creep?" I interrupted, struggling to keep my cool. "You saw her lick my face, right? I didn't ask for that. I didn't even know what to say. She was the one who set it up, not me." My brother scoffed, clearly unconvinced. "Oh, so now you're the innocent one? She told me you've been trying to get close to her for months. And if you're just gonna deny it, then honestly, maybe I don't even want you at my wedding. I don't need this kind of drama. And she doesn't need someone around who's trying to get in her head." I was stunned, my mind racing. His fiancée was not only blaming me but doubling down, accusing me of pursuing her for months? It was insulting and ridiculous on so many levels. And I couldn't believe my brother was buying it. All the years of looking out for him, being his friend, doing my best to help him with everything, even his rocky relationship with her, had all been written off because she'd concocted a lie in response to her own drunken behavior. "You really believe that?" I finally managed, my voice low and seething. "After everything, you think I'd do that to you? She's lying to you. Man, she embarrassed you last night. And now she's turning it around to save herself." But he wasn't listening. "Whatever. Man, just stay away from her. I don't care what you have to say about it. And unless you're ready to apologize for crossing the line, maybe it's best you just don't come around for a while." With that, he hung up, leaving me there, angry and reeling. I couldn't believe what had just happened. How quickly he'd turned on me without even giving me the benefit of the doubt. It was like he didn't even know me. Like the years we'd spent as close as brothers meant nothing. I'd been willing to do anything to support him, even when I thought he was making terrible choices. But apparently, all it took was a few twisted words from her. And suddenly, I was the villain. I sat there, staring at the phone, wondering what my next move should be. One thing was for sure. There was no way I'd apologize for something I didn't do. If he wanted to throw away our relationship over this, then maybe he'd get exactly what he asked for. After our heated call, I didn't hear from my brother. Days stretched on in silence, each one adding fuel to my anger and hurt. He was giving me the cold shoulder, probably convinced that I was a threat to his relationship, someone who'd tried to sabotage his engagement. The ridiculousness of it all gnawed at me, but it didn't seem worth reaching out again. Clearly, he'd made his choice. Then, one night, out of the blue, I got a message from a mutual friend who'd been at the party. She was someone I hadn't spoken to much lately, but we'd known each other since high school. Her text read, "Hey, are you okay? Heard things went south with you and your brother." That simple message brought a whole wave of frustration and embarrassment rushing back. I replied, just saying that yeah, things weren't great and that I was pretty much the villain in his and his fiancée's story. But she quickly responded, "I saw what happened that night. His fiancée was way out of line. No one thinks it was your fault." Those words stunned me. If other people had seen what happened and didn't blame me, why was I getting the brunt of the fallout? I asked her for more details, eager to understand exactly what others had noticed. She explained that people saw how uncomfortable I'd looked when his fiancée put the frosting on my face and then licked it off. My brother's fiancée had been drinking a lot and was in a weirdly flirty mood that night. She'd been draping herself on people, laughing too loudly, and, yes, licking frosting off my face was just the most outrageous thing she'd done in a series of odd choices. I felt a rush of vindication reading her words. But then the real weight of it hit me. My brother knew all of this. He saw it too, yet he chose to believe whatever cover story his fiancée had fed him. A story that painted me as the one who'd been crossing lines, trying to sabotage their relationship. It was easier for him to blame me than to accept that maybe, just maybe, his fiancée wasn't the perfect woman he'd imagined. And then, as if on cue, I received a notification from social media. His fiancée had tagged my brother in a post with a photo of them, all smiles, with the caption, "Together, no matter what anyone tries to come between us." The dig was obvious. It was a public announcement that I was the enemy. I could only shake my head in disbelief at the narrative she was spinning to everyone. I considered my options, trying to figure out how to get out from under this shadow. It felt like they were controlling the story, turning everyone we knew against me with her twisted version of events. But as much as I wanted to blast the truth for everyone to hear, to expose the lies, I held back. Stooping to her level wouldn't help. What would speaking out even accomplish? If my brother couldn't see the truth now, no amount of explaining would open his eyes. Still, I knew I couldn't leave things like this forever. The lies would fester, and I'd end up isolated from people who mattered to me. So, instead of feeding into her drama, I began reaching out to our closest friends, one by one, simply to share my side of the story. I explained what happened, without embellishment, just laying out the facts. And the response was the same. People understood. They saw through her act and sympathized with me, admitting they'd noticed the strange behavior too. Yet, each conversation also chipped away at the idea of ever having my brother back in my life. Even if he apologized, even if he came to his senses and realized the truth, I wasn't sure I could forgive him for abandoning me so quickly. He'd made me the villain, all to protect a relationship that seemed more and more like a ticking time bomb. By the end of the week, I'd come to terms with it. I wasn't going to be a groomsman, or maybe even a guest, at my own brother's wedding. I'd still get calls from mutual friends, who asked if he'd come around. But I always answered the same way: he hasn't. And he probably won't. And, with each person who voiced their support, it became easier to let go. His fiancée's lies had forced a crack in our relationship, a fault line that had split us apart. Maybe he'd never see the truth. Maybe he'd spend his life defending her, choosing her over family, no matter what she did. If that was the life he wanted, I'd let him have it. But I wouldn't let myself be defined by her manipulations. And I certainly wouldn't let myself be part of their toxic cycle. For the first time since the party, I felt a little more at peace. I had the truth, and I had people who believed me. That was more than enough. Life moved forward, as it always does. A few months passed, and the distance between my brother and me grew wider. Sometimes, I'd catch myself wondering if he missed me, if he thought about how things used to be before his fiancée tore a rift between us. But I'd snap myself out of it quickly. I was building my life, moving forward without the burden of their drama. And I knew I'd made the right choice by stepping back. The reality, though, is that some wounds don't heal neatly. They leave jagged scars, reminders of what was lost and the pain it took to lose it. Every now and then, my phone would buzz with a text from a mutual friend, a casual invite to a gathering or event. Each time, I'd find myself scrolling through my brother's social media afterward, wondering if he'd be there, if he'd be smiling with his fiancée, oblivious to the hurt left in his wake. Part of me still longed to see him, to somehow bridge the chasm that had formed between us. But there was no point, no benefit in opening old wounds. Then, the invitations began to mention wedding details. Friends wanted to know if I was coming, if I'd RSVP'd, if I'd found a date. I hadn't responded. As far as I was concerned, the wedding was his business, not mine. Still, the curiosity gnawed at me. I wondered how things would play out, whether he'd follow through with the wedding plans now that everyone knew the full story. Deep down, I wanted to believe he'd come to his senses and see her for what she was. One day, my mother called, her voice more strained than usual. "Are you really not coming to the wedding?" she asked. Trying to keep a neutral tone, I could hear the hurt behind her question, but I didn't want to engage in another emotional tug-of-war. "I wasn't invited, Mom," I answered, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "You were." Indirectly, she pressed. "Your brother said you'd know that you were welcome, that he wants you there." This vague, backhanded invitation infuriated me. After everything he'd said, all the blame he'd placed on me, he didn't even have the decency to reach out himself? If he wants me there so badly, he knows how to contact me directly, I replied, hearing the bitterness in my own voice. She sighed, disappointed but resigned. I understood her position. As a mother, she wanted her family whole and united, but she couldn't see how broken things had become. This wasn't just some sibling spat that would heal with time, this was deeper. And I wasn't willing to be the one to smooth it over. For the next week, the guilt gnawed at me. Mom's disappointment haunted my thoughts. But then, I'd remember his fiancée's actions at the party, her audacity, and his subsequent betrayal. I knew what I had to do. The day of the wedding came and went, And I stayed far away, refusing to be part of a facade. I spent that day surrounded by close friends who understood my choice, who helped me remember why I'd walked away. It was bittersweet, but I realized that life had given me a chance to build a new support system. One free from the toxicity my brother's fiancée had brought into my life. Days later, I saw the wedding photos through mutual friends. They looked blissfully happy, which brought a strange mixture of relief and lingering hurt. There they were, celebrating their life together, and I was just a memory in the margins. But I didn't regret staying away. I'd reclaimed my life and peace of mind, no longer defined by the betrayal or their blame. It wasn't easy letting go of the brother I once knew. I'd mourned that relationship, and maybe I still was, in small ways, but with each day, the wound closed a little more. I knew I'd find peace. Maybe not with him, but certainly with myself, and in the end, that was all I could control. In the months that followed, I found myself redefining what family meant to me. Cutting ties with my brother had been painful, but it also freed me in ways I hadn't expected. My life no longer revolved around walking on eggshells or wondering what new accusation or issue he'd throw at me. I was no longer anxiously anticipating the next family gathering or dreading his fiancée's antics. Instead, I was discovering a life that felt, for the first time in years, like my own. For a long time, I had been defined by my relationships with my brother and my family, by being the good, younger sibling. The one always expected to step aside and make peace. I'd played that role so well for so long that I almost forgot there was a part of me that wanted something else: independence, respect, and a sense of worth apart from my family's expectations. Now, having let go of the family dynamic that held me back, I was forced to focus on myself. And it was a terrifying but exhilarating challenge. At work, I threw myself into projects, going after promotions I hadn't dared to pursue before. I was tired of blending into the background, of taking the safe route and shrinking myself to accommodate others. I began to realize how much my brother's presence and judgments had limited me. His criticisms and backhanded comments had sown doubt in my mind, making me second-guess my potential, my ideas, and my ability to succeed on my terms. It was time to put those doubts behind me. I also reconnected with friends, some of whom I'd lost touch with while trying to maintain my strained relationship with my brother. It was refreshing to be with people who knew me outside of my family's complexities. People who genuinely wanted to see me thrive. They celebrated my wins and offered support on my off days. And it felt good to be surrounded by positivity without the constant drama that had been my reality for so long. Through this process, I found myself building new relationships with extended family members I'd barely had time for before. It was like rediscovering hidden corners of my family tree that had always been there, waiting for me to find them. These relatives became a new kind of family, offering love and understanding without the judgment I'd grown accustomed to. They reminded me that family doesn't have to be close in age, proximity, or even ideology to be meaningful. Yet, as the holidays approached, the ache of missing my brother intensified. I knew that my mother, especially, was struggling with the rift between us. I visited her often, not wanting her to feel caught in the middle. One evening, as I helped her decorate her Christmas tree, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Are you sure this is what you want?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. "I miss having you two together." I took a deep breath, steadying myself against the familiar pull of guilt. "Mom, I didn't choose this." He pushed me away. "I'm not the one who created this situation. And I can't be the one to fix it. Not this time." She nodded, accepting it, though I could see the pain lingering in her eyes. But I knew that if I caved now, it would only reinforce the unhealthy dynamic that had taken root over the years. Setting boundaries was a choice I had to keep making, even if it wasn't easy. For the first time in my life, I understood that it was okay to prioritize my peace and well-being over maintaining a relationship that only brought pain. And slowly, day by day, I felt myself becoming stronger. There was no need for a constant fight or a desperate desire to hold on to someone who didn't respect me. This was my life, my happiness, and I finally had the courage to claim it. The pressure to reconcile with my brother came from all angles. Friends, family, and even coworkers who knew the situation would gently suggest I give it one more try, or say, family is family. After all, I understood their sentiment. They hadn't seen the full picture. They hadn't witnessed the constant digs at my heritage, The backhanded remarks about my worth. Or the night of my party when my brother's fiancée decided to cross a line. And he turned the blame on me. Despite my resolve, their words had a way of chipping away at my confidence. It's hard to hear, over and over, that maybe I should be the bigger person. That my family unit depended on it. But each time the thought of giving in tempted me. The anger and hurt reminded me of what I'd sacrificed for my brother's approval. I'd buried pieces of myself, values, beliefs, and dreams, to keep the peace. And what had it gained me? One afternoon, I found myself sitting with my mom again. She'd invited me over for lunch and, as usual, brought up my brother in casual conversation. It started with her reminiscing about our childhood, but it quickly turned into subtle hints. "You know, he misses you," she said gently, setting a cup of tea in front of me. "He might not show it, but he does. Can't you talk to him?" There it was again, the plea. It was in her eyes, soft and pleading, in the way she held her breath waiting for my response. She wanted the family she remembered back together. And that vision included both her sons standing side by side, reconciled and whole. But every time I thought about picking up the phone, I'd recall how he'd treated me. The lengths I went to trying to keep a relationship that was largely one-sided. It dawned on me that while I had been raised to believe family meant unconditional acceptance, it didn't mean I had to endure disrespect or compromise my dignity. I took a deep breath, the weight of the situation pressing on my chest. "Mom, I want peace as much as you do. But I've been the one holding us together for years. And what did it get me? I lost my sense of self trying to meet his standards. Trying to make everyone happy. I can't go back to that." She nodded slowly, but I could tell she didn't fully understand. And maybe she never would. As much as it hurt, I knew I wasn't doing this to be cruel. I was doing it because I needed to honor myself for once. I knew that keeping my boundaries was the only way I could stay true to myself without slipping back into the cycle of always trying to please him. A few weeks later, an unexpected message popped up on my phone. It was from my brother. "I don't get why you're doing this. I thought we were brothers. And family is supposed to stick together. So, what, are you just done with me?" Reading it, I felt a pang of hurt. I was sad that it had come to this and disappointed that he still couldn't see his own role in our fractured relationship. I wanted to type a message back. To explain. To rehash all the things he'd done and said that had hurt me. But I knew it would only lead to another round of accusations or defensiveness. He didn't want to understand, he wanted me to apologize. To sweep it all under the rug. And move on as if nothing had happened. So, I took a deep breath and replied simply, "I want a healthy relationship. But it can't be at the expense of my self-respect. If you're willing to meet me halfway, I'm here. But I won't go back to how things were." I stared at my phone for a while, waiting for his response, but there was none. It hurt to let the silence stretch out. But I knew this was the only path to peace. Even if it was painful. I wasn't giving up on family. I was finally giving myself the respect and love I had always craved from him. And maybe one day, he'd see that. Until then, I'd keep moving forward. As the days turned into weeks, I adjusted to life without my brother in it. Which was strange, considering he'd been such a big part of my world for as long as I could remember. Each day came with waves of emotions, a mix of freedom, relief, grief, and sometimes a tinge of guilt. But alongside the emptiness, I began to feel something I hadn't in a long time, a sense of my own strength. In those quieter moments, I found myself reflecting on who I was, independent of the strained ties with my brother. I started to see that for years, I'd been molding myself to fit into his expectations and the role he wanted me to play. Now, without those constraints, I was discovering sides of myself I'd never allowed to fully emerge. During that time, I poured myself into my work as a paramedic, being able to focus on helping people, responding to crises, and making a difference gave me a powerful sense of purpose and confidence. When I was out on calls, I wasn't worried about who thought I was real, family, or whether my efforts were being recognized by anyone but the patients and their loved ones. In the back of the ambulance, there were no complicated family dynamics or unresolved hurt. It was simple, clear, and fulfilling in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, as I was clearing out some boxes from my mom's house, I stumbled upon an old family photo album. There we were, my brother and I as kids. All smiles, side by side, not a single trace of the tension that had come to define our adult relationship. There were pictures from birthdays, Holidays, random days spent playing in the backyard, and a few awkward teenage years. Seeing those moments made me nostalgic, but it also highlighted how much things had changed between us. In another life, maybe we could have stayed that way, two brothers, close and unwaveringly loyal to each other. But we weren't those kids anymore, and I knew that holding onto the past only made the present more painful. I could cherish those memories without trying to force a relationship that had grown toxic. Loving him as a brother didn't mean I had to keep subjecting myself to his resentment, criticism, and the pain he continually brought into my life. Gradually, I started reconnecting with old friends and investing more in the relationships that nurtured me rather than drained me. I made time to visit my mom more, keeping the conversation light and focused on her well-being. She'd gently bring up my brother occasionally, her eyes searching mine for any hint that I might relent. But I'd shake my head gently, reassuring her that while I still loved him, I couldn't sacrifice my peace to make him feel whole. Surprisingly, I noticed a shift in myself. Without the constant back and forth with my brother or the weight of his judgment on my shoulders, I felt lighter. I started making plans for myself, taking up new hobbies, exploring more in my career, and even considering going back to school to further my qualifications. For the first time, I wasn't worried about my choices being judged. I wasn't scared of not measuring up to anyone else's standards. It dawned on me that, in all the years I'd been striving to be a good brother, I'd never really asked what I wanted out of life. I'd been so consumed with keeping our bond intact that I'd let my own dreams and goals take a back seat. Now, with each decision I made, I was honoring my values and aspirations without fear of judgment. As the months rolled by, I still thought of him, and I wouldn't deny that a part of me wished we could find some kind of peace. But I wasn't willing to sacrifice my dignity or happiness for a version of brotherhood that came at such a steep cost. I'd been loyal to the idea of family for as long as I could remember. But I finally understood that true loyalty had to include loyalty to myself. In the end, maybe I didn't need his approval, nor did I need to justify my choices to anyone else. I was finally giving myself permission to be the person I wanted to be, not the one anyone else expected me to be. It was liberating, empowering, and, for the first time, I felt like I was truly living on my own terms. I'd always thought that strength was about resilience and holding on, but I was learning that sometimes, real strength lay in the courage to let go. Life, in the months after cutting my brother off, took on a different rhythm. It was one I hadn't expected but welcomed more than I'd have thought possible. With each day, I felt myself growing into a new chapter that felt free from the weight of past grievances, from my brother's resentment and accusations, and even from the part of me that had clung so hard to the ideal of family. The distance from him brought clarity and relief, but it also brought moments of emptiness. He was my brother, and though the bond was strained and often painful, he had been woven into the fabric of my life. So, naturally, there were times I caught myself reminiscing or questioning if I'd made the right call. What if he reached out, willing to make amends? Could we possibly find a way to move forward and mend our relationship? These thoughts would creep in late at night or in quiet moments, like the first few miles of a long morning run or during my drive home from a long shift. But every time I imagined a possible reconciliation, I remembered all the boundaries I'd had to put in place just to keep my own peace. It wasn't easy, but I'd learned to quiet those urges and focus on the relationships that brought joy, trust, and mutual respect into my life. My friends, supportive family members, and the colleagues who felt more like a second family all helped fill the gap. I was learning to accept that not all family ties would look the way we might want. And that was okay. I still worried about our mom, though. The heartbreak she felt from the wedge between us was evident. She tried not to bring him up, but I could see the pain in her eyes. She often looked at me with that motherly concern, and I knew she still hoped for a way back to our old family unity. I wanted to give her that, but not at the expense of my own well-being. So, I'd always reassure her the best I could. I'd tell her I was here for her, and I meant it. One day, my phone buzzed, and it was a text from my brother. After all these months of silence, he sent a short, seemingly innocent message. "Hope you're doing well." It felt surreal, as if I'd been transported back to a time when a message like that would have felt normal. But now, with the history between us, I couldn't just brush it off or reply lightly. My mind immediately raced back to everything that had led us to this place, the cruel accusations, His partner's bizarre behavior at my birthday, and his refusal to see how hurtful his words and actions had been. Even though part of me missed him, I knew responding with anything other than caution would only reopen wounds that had taken too long to heal. The weight of his text settled into my chest, and I spent the day mulling over whether or not to respond. Ultimately, I decided to honor the boundaries I'd set. After everything that had happened, I couldn't just fall back into the same patterns. So, I decided not to reply. It felt harsh but necessary, like finally shutting a door that had been left ajar for too long. In the following weeks, I put even more effort into nurturing my own well-being. I dove headfirst into work, found solace in the small rituals that brought me peace, and even signed up for a half marathon. I focused on who I wanted to be and the kind of life I wanted to build. Free from the toxic cycle that had come to define my relationship with my brother. Setting boundaries had given me room to grow, and though the process wasn't without pain, it brought the strength and resilience I needed to build a life based on love, respect, and genuine connection. I learned that sometimes we can love someone deeply and still choose to protect ourselves by stepping away. It wasn't about winning or losing, about who was right or wrong. It was simply about self-respect and moving forward. I'd finally accepted that while some relationships are worth fighting for, others require us to let go, not out of anger, but out of self-love and a commitment to living a life that feels like our own. And so, I kept moving forward, with a peace that I knew would guide me wherever the journey led. Months have passed since that last message from my brother, and I've settled into a new phase of my life. One where I no longer feel the pull of unresolved family drama or the ache of what-ifs. I can breathe a little easier now. It's funny how freeing it feels when you stop waiting for things to go back to how they once were. I've come to understand that some endings are necessary to begin living in a way that truly honors who we are. The journey hasn't been without its moments of doubt or sadness. There are days when I miss the idea of having him close again, of laughing about shared memories or reliving inside jokes only siblings could understand. But these thoughts feel more like faint echoes now, reminders of something familiar but no longer essential. I've finally made peace with the fact that while he may always be my brother, that doesn't mean we have to stay in each other's lives to keep that connection. It's a difficult realization, and maybe some will never fully understand it, but it's mine, and I own it. My mom still hopes for reconciliation, and I don't fault her for it. She wants her family whole. That's what any parent would want. We've had honest conversations where I've explained my need for distance, for a life unburdened by the anger and resentment that had built up between us. She's been supportive, even if I know it hurts her. In her own way, she's found ways to bring joy back into her life, and I think we've grown closer, finding a quiet bond in the mutual understanding of loving someone from afar. I've also started spending more time with people who genuinely care for and support me, friends, colleagues, my partner, people who bring lightness and laughter rather than judgment. I feel gratitude for these relationships in a way I never had before. Every genuine moment shared with them, every laugh, and every silent understanding is a reminder of the kind of relationships I want to nurture. And then there's the work. I've thrown myself into it, taking on more challenging cases, volunteering when I can, and even starting to think about future opportunities that could help me grow. Every day brings the satisfaction of progress, of moving toward a version of myself that is stronger, clearer, and more at peace. I've come to realize that I want to be someone who stands up for themselves, who knows their worth, and who won't be weighed down by relationships that don't honor that. It's strange how life works. Sometimes, letting go is the only way to move forward. I didn't see that in the beginning. I was too caught up in what I was losing to see what I might gain. But now, on this side of things, it's all so clear. The boundaries I set weren't about punishing my brother or creating distance for distance's sake. They were about preserving my own well-being, about finally putting myself first. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe one day he'll change, maybe he won't. Either way, I've made peace with the fact that his path is his own, as is mine. I no longer hold anger, only acceptance. If he finds his way back one day with a different outlook, I'll see how I feel then. Until then, though, I've got a life to live, a life that's mine. Finally, truly mine. And that, I realize now, is enough.